Good to go? All right. All right, this week's topic is causation. So first I'm going to talk about a little about some common examples of causal questions we have in criminal justice and why we ultimately care about causation in criminal justice. After that, I'll be turning to the two main types of causal explanations, nomothetic versus idiographic, some more big fancy words for you to squeeze into your vocabulary again. After that, we'll get into the causation criteria, or basically the kind of the necessary conditions you have to meet in order to be able to demonstrate a causal relationship. And we'll also talk about two relevant factors tied in with that, mechanism and context. So you remember we talked about internal validity, also called causal validity, so the extent to which a study is able to demonstrate a causal relationship. Now we're starting to get into kind of the more nitty-gritty details of that. Last thing, we'll talk about two common errors in causal reasoning we can make, and then just like usual, some practice questions. All right. So first thing, there's lots of causal questions we have in criminal justice about crime, about victimization, these types of things. One we've talked about a little bit, especially given those recent protests that were going on. We have causal questions like this. Does a person's race, ethnicity influence how criminal justice authorities treat them? So for example, does a person's race, ethnicity influence the likelihood that a police officer is going to use force in an interaction with them? Or maybe does the race, ethnicity of a defendant influence the sentence they're ultimately going to receive? Other examples that we've kind of touched on before, we might wonder about, do socioeconomic conditions influence things like crime rates, victimization rates? And then another one we've talked about more on kind of the program side. So questions like, do reentry programs influence the likelihood that someone on probation or parole is going to recidivate? Talked a little bit, Adriana, a little bit about your study. So kind of the causal question in yours was, does childhood sex abuse have some sort of causal influence on potential kind of psychological problems like PTSD and that type of thing, anxiety, depression? So these are just some examples, but there's all sorts of causal questions we have in criminal justice broadly. And why do we care about causation? Well, one big reason is if we can identify the causes, we can do something about them. That's kind of the idea. We can adopt policies, we can implement new programs, design new interventions to address those causes, and then in turn have an impact on something. So for example, something like crime, right? We might be able to come up with a new program or a new policy that can address something that causes crime, and in turn we can reduce crime, stuff like that. Another kind of tied to that policy program idea, we typically want our policies and programs to be effective. We want them to have an intended causal impact on things we want them to have an impact on. An important element of that, often these programs are taxpayer funded, right? So it's public money. And in general, if you're paying for something, you expect it to work, right? If you buy a new iPhone or something like that, you expect it to work. You'd probably be pretty upset if it didn't work. Hi, Emily. So real quick, I'm just filming this over here, just to give you an idea, but just to give you a heads up on that. And then tied to that policy program idea, beyond the cost, right, we ultimately want safe communities. We want programs, policies that have an effect on that, right? Maybe reduce the likelihood that someone might be a victim of a crime, make people feel safe in the community, this type of thing. So we're talking about two main types of causal explanations. This first one is going to be the main focus today. I'll only briefly touch on the other one. This first type is called nomothetic. Again, a nice big word to use. You can use to impress your friends and family. This tends to skew more towards quantitative research. So the basic idea we're looking at here, changes in the independent variable lead to changes in the dependent variable. And we had talked about the direction of association before, whether it's positive or negative, right? So a positive relationship, independent variable goes up, dependent variable also goes up. Negative relationship, independent variable goes up, dependent variable goes down. So this is going to be our main focus today, talking about, again, main idea, changes in one variable ultimately lead to changes in another variable. What was that? Causation. I have the note. Do you want the note-taking guide too? Yeah. Yeah. I'll also mention too, I can explain why, but I'm filming the lecture over here too. That's why it's a little weird. So I know typically you throw your shoes at me during lectures, but try to hold back this time. Alright, so at this point, yeah, you haven't missed anything major so far. We're just getting into the two main types of causal explanations. So that first bullet point on the note-taking guide, nomothetic versus idiographic. So we just went over the nomothetic. Basic idea here is this kind of image. Changes in one variable lead to changes in another variable. That typically is going to be positive or negative, right? One goes up, other goes up. One goes up, other goes down. Now in contrast, we have what are called idiographic causal explanations, and this tends to be more the focus of qualitative research. So I think a simple way of thinking about it is we're trying to figure out the causal story of something. Kind of like the sequence of events, actions, these types of things that ultimately led to a particular outcome. So when we talked about qualitative research before, we kind of used that, right? People's stories, their life experiences, that type of thing. So you can kind of think about like kind of a broad question like this. You know, what's events in your life ultimately led you to be sitting here today in this class right now? Well, maybe it'd be something like maybe your parents kind of always expressed and placed a high value on education. Maybe they really encouraged you to, you know, try hard in school and that type of thing. Maybe you had some experience that got you interested in criminal justice, and you said, hey, I want to learn more about this. These types of things, right? So kind of think about it like your memoir, maybe your autobiography. Again, it's kind of the story. We're not going to talk too much about this, but I just kind of want to talk about that idea because it's not the only way we can think about causation in terms of changes in one variable leading to changes in another. We can also do something like this where we kind of want that story. Another quick thing I want to mention, you don't have to memorize this, it's this idea of stochastic determinism. Have you ever heard the word determinism before? No? No? So I'll kind of give it a little bit of breakdown. But with social science, we're generally assuming stochastic determinism. Again, you don't have to memorize this, but I just kind of want to make a point about it. Stochastic, one of these fancy words we always use, stochastic basically means probability. Determinism is the idea that events, actions, outcomes are determined by various factors. So what does this mean for what we're talking about, research and criminal justice, social sciences more broadly? Well, what it means is we're predicting the likelihood, the probability of some event, action, bless you, event, action, or outcome. So one thing we had talked about before is these risk assessments. We might give them to people on kind of starting on parole or probation. And that risk assessment we're going to use to kind of predict the likelihood that they recidivate or reoffend, right? Well, where that kind of stochastic point comes in is, let's say we do this risk assessment and we place people on high risk, medium risk, low risk categories. Well, we're not saying that everyone in that high risk category is going to offend. But those people in that high risk category should be more likely to offend.